Hey, before we get started, I just wanted to jump in and apologize. As you'll soon hear, this was actually our second attempt to record this episode, after the first one was sacrificed to the podcasting gods. Sadly, that sacrifice seems to have come up a little bit short, so you may still notice some audio jankiness, and we also lost the last couple minutes of our conversation. While I can't capture the nuance of that, I'll say that one takeaway from it is that you should check out Seamus Heaney's audiobook of his translation of Beowulf, which Elsa strongly recommends. Also, you can find Elsa online as Snarkbat in all the internet places. Again, I'm really sorry about the degraded audio quality, and know that I really appreciate each and every one of you for listening. Warning. This episode contains some strong language. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Trunk, reading the stories that didn't make it. I'm Hilary B. Bisnieks. Listeners, today I'm very excited to introduce my guest. Elsa Sjunneson is an author, editor, disability rights activist, and all-around general amazing person. Elsa, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, sometimes there's just a problem with the podcast audio and we have to redo it, and it's, honestly, I'm never sad when I have to re-record an episode like we're doing right now, because it's just, more good conversation. So, happy for round 2.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure that this will be just as interesting of a conversation as the last one we had.
If not better. So, Elsa, you're going to be reading to us out of The Livelong Night, is that correct?
That is correct.
And is there anything that we need to know about before we go into this?
So, this is a book that I wrote in 2017, and it is about Tara O'Deal, who is a blind woman who can hear the dead. I wanted to sort of play with the trope of blind people being able to see ghosts, and instead of letting her see things, because she's blind, I was like, well, why don't we just have her hear them? And then to make things more interesting, let's cause a supernatural apocalypse in New York City that causes every single ghost in the city to be free roaming and also have the ability to, say, possess people. So she can hear what's wrong. And she's one of the few people who can. So it's about how she becomes sort of the person who can help people escape and can help people be safe in a New York that is profoundly unsafe.
Yes, absolutely.
And this comes from early on in the book. There are no ghosties in this section, but there are other things. Gripping my cane a bit tighter in my right hand, I scan the floor of the subway with it and feel my cane gently bump off the knee-high boot of a woman, I assume, sitting in the disability seats. Well, okay, I can stand. It's only an hour. I'm a grown-up New York girl. I reach up with my left hand and grasp hold of the cold metal bar above my head. We haven't gone more than a stop before something is wrong. It's always something with the MTA. This time there's an injured passenger in another car, or so the soft announcer voice says over the intercom. Franklin Avenue, fortunately, has another route for me to take. It's not going to be so bad. The whole point is that I'll get there, right? Stepping onto the platform, I switch over to the 5 train, also packed. Maybe when everyone gets off at Union Square or Grand Central, I'll be able to sit down. I've got 13 stops until 125th Street, and then I'll either walk or take a crosstown bus to get to Columbia University. I could transfer over to the L at 14th Street, but frankly, the L's a mess, and I don't want to deal with all the stairs just to transfer to the 1 train, and that's another hour once I'm even in the city, if I'm lucky. My commute isn't ideal. Most students live up in Morningside Heights, but I live where I know the lay of the land like my own skin. I'm able to tell when we get to my stop by how many people get off the train anyway, so instead of counting stops, I'm going over the things I have prepared and studied for my exam. I've already passed my state exams. This is the last moment of my degree. Yes, I'm a blind teacher. My plan for classroom management includes: the train takes a sharp turn to the left, screeching to a stop at what has to be Brooklyn Bridge. 2 stops left. The train jerks to a start again, hightailing it for Union Square. My blindness is a defining part of who I am, but the way I stand in a classroom is the same way I do in the city, with confidence. My world isn't dark. I've never known how to see. There is no blackness, no fear of the lack of seeing. A strong community ethic instilled in my students from the beginning. I choose to ask students to work with me rather than against me. And then, from the front of the train, I hear someone swearing. Sounds like the lights have gone off. Not a problem for me. A few people on the train joke about the MTA being run by crazed gremlins, and the tenor of the car goes back to normal. I've spent all my credit hours working with students like myself, students who are living in a world not built for them. At least this train car doesn't smell like pee. The 2 train I took to Atlantic had smelled like drying pee, and that's never pleasant, especially when I have no idea where the puddle is until it's far too late. Down at the far end of the train car, someone is banging on the conductor's door. It's probably stuck. Usually people are in and out of those with impunity, risking their lives to hit one more train car to panhandle to a few more travelers, or to escape a train car with an even worse smell than this one. I've become nearly immune to the sense of the subway, not because I don't smell the things, but because I've trained myself not to smell when I'm down here. Breathing through my mouth is a survival skill. The train picks up speed, and the other passengers are getting restless. A woman close to me is whispering to her whimpering daughter that the conductor knows what he's doing and that we're all going to be okay. But Mommy! The girl's voice comes from my right below. Good, she has a seat. She sounds about 6 or so. What are those bright sparks? They look like big sparklers. The screech of the train tells me that she's talking about the rails sparking. Not good. At the other end of the train car from me, the woman who was talking about the lights has gotten louder, her words rising to a fever pitch. Unlike the normal rantings of a subway doomsday prophet, her words are chilling because I believe them. Is the conductor drunk or high? She screams, banging her fists on the outer door. Turn the fucking lights back on. The car train tips, reeling on one side of its wheels for a moment before slamming back onto both sides of the track. Everyone in the car feels that in their bones, me included. My jaw grinds on impact. Mommy! The little girl screams and is shushed by half the train car. Her mother begins humming a lullaby in an attempt to calm her daughter. Fuck. No lights. No train. The train being unreliable. Do we have any power? I focus. The gravity on the train has shifted. My feet are no longer steadily planted, but the floor rocks back and forth like a surfboard on an uneven water. Not like the easy balanced movement of a train being propelled safely, but a speeding train barely controlled by the driver. My ability to stay upright became infinitely more difficult. The train skids and screams forward with entropy alone. As the train careens to a halt, we all lurch forward. The tendons in my left arm wrench and the car erupts in chaos. My train lost power. My train lost fucking power. How am I going to get to school now?
Whew. That is still chilling, and I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are so many, details in that speak directly to my heart as, an East Coast city boy. Although I've never spent much time in New York City, I definitely know the smells of public transit in Philadelphia, the stinky garbage city of my heart. And also spent time working in waste management, so, the whole breathing through your mouth as a survival mechanism, just right to my heart.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think New Yorkers especially recognize, because sometimes even not just the subway, but the city itself can have these really unpleasant smells. Like in July, when it's super hot and people have just been peeing on the sidewalk, It's bad.
Yeah, one of the times that I visited Philadelphia recently, I had just gotten off the plane, and the jetway smelled like hot garbage juice, and within, 30 seconds of getting off the plane, I had gotten something, some little speck in my eye that stayed there for the rest of the week, it felt like, and I was just like, oh yeah, I'm home.
Yep. Welcome home.
Welcome home. It's terrible here. You still love it, though, for some reason.
There's reasons I left, and also.
Yeah. So, I was particularly excited for you to be reading an excerpt out of this book because I remember it was something that you talked about on a panel called Stop Killing Us at the San Jose Worldcon, and talking about the focus of the panel was on not just doing horrible things to disabled people all the time in fiction. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, but particularly because, we have this trope that you're all too familiar with already of bury your gaze, but you actually coined a term for that same phenomenon happening to disabled people in fiction.
I did. So I coined the term trunking on Twitter, which is specifically referring to Mad-Eye Moody in the Harry Potter books, because if you think about it, Mad-Eye Moody is portrayed as a disabled character who has, a leadership position, and he makes a lot of difference in people's lives, but then it turns out that actually he was the evil person all along, and the real Mad-Eye Moody has been locked in a trunk for the entire school year. Mm-hmm. Which is pretty fucked up.
Yeah.
And we see it in other books. One of the other books that's come out very recently that's been quite popular has been Gideon the Ninth, which also includes basically a disabled character who is a vessel for evil. I don't want to spoil anything, but that's a fairly common trope, is to basically use a disabled body in order to disguise something evil or dangerous. And I think that sort of that extends to even talking about blind characters in other genres. Like, the blind character is always the one who has spooky eyes, and they can see ghosts, or they're seers, and that trope doesn't feel empowering, because they're never portrayed as being the good guy, or they're never portrayed as being helpful or wanting to be part of the community. It's always the distant creepy seer who everyone is a little bit creeped out by.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about movies. The only movie I can think of with even close to a positive portrayal of a blind character, and a character who doesn't have too many terrible things happen to them, is the Book of Eli, which, spoilers for the Book of Eli, a 15-year-old movie, but even there, his blindness is always treated as very much an othering, even though his blindness is the big reveal at the end.
Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting. The Book of Eli is one of the books I haven't watched, and I've watched most movies that deal with blindness. Research for Being Seen was watching a lot of things that made me very angry. But I'm not entirely sure why the Book of Eli didn't make it on my watch list, except that it dealt with a man, and a lot of my work has been focused on women and queer people and how their experience of disability gets sort of treated, because I do think that there's a gender component to how we look at disability in media.
Yeah, and I will say for the Book of Eli that it is very much sort of pattern on Daredevil, except for, the blindness being the big reveal rather than a central part of the character. But it is he has basically superhuman hearing. He doesn't have Daredevil's red sight, but he has, his preternaturally good at, like, shooting bad guys and things like that because he can just hear them super well, and, you know.
Right.
And like, I know that's, you know, that's something that the Livelong Night kind of is in conversation with, in a way. Like you mentioned, that she can hear ghosts, she can't see ghosts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Tara can hear them, and one of the things that's interesting is she's always been able to hear them. Like, this isn't some special sneaky power, it's just she always has been able to hear ghosts. It's something that is about her. And so one of the ways that I sort of illustrate that is that she, in certain parts of the book, actually uses the ghosts like anchor locations for how she navigates the city, which really fucks her over when the ghosts are able to move.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Because she's like, I'm sorry, you're supposed to be on the Lower East Side, and you are now up in Morningside Heights. Like, what is going on? So, there's this shift, I guess, for her, where she stops being able to use this adaptive aid that is relying on her supernatural ability to navigate her city. But what I thought was interesting about that, too, is that it takes away sort of the idea of, oh, well, blind people can see. Because we culturally really have a hard time with binaries. And so, like, the assumption is that all blind people are the same. So I wanted to make sure that, like, even as a fully blind character who falls into sort of the traditional visual model, she needed to adapt to the world in her own way. And giving her the ability to hear the dead kind of did some of that for me.
Yeah. I really like the idea of ghosts as sort of an adaptive aid or a navigational waypoint. That's really just, like, you know, it's something that is really neat, and I don't think that a sighted person would necessarily have even thought of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're not thinking about what things sound like in the world that you live in, like, but one of her coping mechanisms, she's like, oh, I know where I'm going because I can hear Peter Stuyvesant's peg leg in the background. And that's how I know I'm over by this specific church, because he basically takes... And that's actually an urban legend, like, that's a ghost story in New York City, is that Peter Stuyvesant haunts this specific church, and you can hear him walking around because he had a wooden leg.
That's awesome. I love that.
My apologies for the large truck.
No worries. So the one of the other things in the Livelong Night, and, you know, something that we talk about also in, like, media with queer people in it, is, like, you know, sometimes you have to make something bad happen to one of your marginalized characters because the story demands it, but
well, it's
it
interesting.
becomes a little bit less difficult if you have more.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the hardest things about writing fiction about disability is that I have to write ableism into my work. Like,
yeah.
You can't tell a story about disability without ableism unless if you are writing in a fantasy world where ableism doesn't exist. And I don't just mean a fantasy world like with, you know, dragons and unicorns. I mean, like, if you're writing a contemporary story and there's no ableism, I call that fantasy. So...
yeah, for sure.
I do have to put my characters in really sometimes dangerous situations. And Tara definitely experiences violence by people who are exploiting her inability to see them. And that was really tough to write. But it was really important because I could actually show her fighting back. I could show her surviving. And I think that that's important, too. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and they actually happen to good people an awful lot in the real world. And so giving people the opportunity to see disabled people actually, like, deal with that, I think is a bonus. Even if it's hard to write, even if you have to include ableism in your work, I think it's actually validating to see disabled people problem solve and survive.
Yeah, for sure. And, like, you know, that is, like, as an abled person, that makes sense to me, like, in sort of an abstract way, but it also, like, as a queer person, makes sense to me in, like, a much more concrete way of, like, you know, in the last decade, we've seen so much more queer representation in media, and more positive queer representation in media, which, you know, in neither case is it perfect by any means, or, you know, has any sort of, like, real parity to mainstream abled cis white, you know, everything normative patriarchal media, but getting to read books or watch movies or whatever that are about queer characters makes it feel better, and, like, makes it feel validating when bad things happen to them, because you can say, like, yeah, this isn't just, like, punishing the different character. This is, you know, I see something of myself in them, and I get to, like, feel validated there. So that's a really, that's really cool to have that.
It is. Well, and it's interesting, too, because, you know, it happens with queer characters, too. And I think we're seeing some of that in a lot of fiction written by marginalized authors. Like, we're getting to see people sort of say, well, this is how I solve the problems of being in the body that I live in.
Yeah. So you've already mentioned being seen sort of tangentially in mentioning that you consumed a lot of media to inform this book, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about Being Seen, One Deafblind Woman's Fight to End Ableism.
It's a funny book. I don't mean funny, haha. I mean, it's an odd book to talk about. You know, you write a memoir at 36, and you kind of have to accept where the chips fall when it comes to what you said about people and how they feel about it, because everybody's still alive. Do not recommend writing a memoir at 36 unless if you're really ready for it.
Right.
But I wanted to talk about what the real impact of our media is on disabled people who are living today. And the only way to do that is to compare and contrast. And so what I do is I literally take examples from media, and then I have them talk to my own lived experience, and I interweave cultural criticism and memoir, is more or less how it works. I think it works. I think I made it work. But it's definitely,
you've been stacking up the starred reviews, so...
Yeah, apparently Booklist and Kirkus both feel like it worked. So, yeah. I think one of the things that helped is knowing that because non-disabled people so often are getting their introduction to disabled bodies through media, it's a really easy through line to say, okay, so if you've been seeing this representation of blindness for decades, this is what you think it is. And this is what it's actually like to live in a body like that. So one of the sections that I do talk about is I talk about the horror genre. And that's sort of how I break it down. And I use a bunch of different genres per chapter, and I kind of take them one at a time, tear them to pieces, and then don't put them back together because not my job. So in the horror chapter, I talk about how in horror movies, it's always somebody you don't know. Like in the movie Hush, it's a stranger breaking into a deaf woman's house. And A Quiet Place, it's alien monsters. In Darkness, it's somebody who was bad to the main character's mother, but it's not actually her person. And the line that I use in the book is the subtitle of that chapter is "The Call is Coming from Inside the House," because it's actually not stranger danger. It is the people who know you and love and are supposed to love you. Disabled people experience a high level of domestic violence. They experience a high level of caregiver violence, and so I talk about how like it's actually not what's real. Horror is missing the point.
Yeah, and you know it's interesting because I think that one of the horror is one of the more mainstream genres in terms of having any sort of
representation for disabled characters.
And in horror, you are either a monster or you're a victim. There is no in between.
Yeah. Which, same thing for queer rep. Horror has historically had a lot of queer rep, and it's almost always either queers being victimized or queers
being the monsters.
In the TV show that was based on the Scream film franchise, they made a choice. And the choice was that the reason why everybody's getting murdered is because a disabled kid can't get a date to the prom.
Oh, great.
I have no regrets for spoilers here, by the way, because everything I'm talking about is terrible media that you should not be giving your money to.
Right. Yeah, spoiler warning for the whole rest of the episode. We will spoil more things, I'm almost certain.
That's basically my job. I'm the disability activist Killjoy. I spoil things for fun, profit, and education.
So you have written fiction, you have written nonfiction, you have a memoir coming out, and I'd really love to hear some of your perspective on how you approach memoir and nonfiction as opposed to how you approach fiction.
So I write fiction very linearly. I need to tell the story in the order of the things as they happen, because everything interlocks. And the choices that you make inform the next choice that you make, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's a good example of that is if you're writing noir, you have to make sure that each completely subtle, normal choice leads to darker choices that ultimately lead you to kill somebody. And that's just how my brain works. It needs to have that trajectory in order to tell a story in a way that it makes sense outside of my brain. Nonfiction does not work like that for me. Being Seen was written in chunks. And then I basically had to play with the entire book like a jigsaw puzzle until it fit right. And then I had to go in and basically write connective tissue at the end of each chapter to link it to the next one so that it actually made sense. But I spent a lot of time with my editor and with my crypt partners basically playing so if it fits here, where does this go?
Yeah, I imagine, that would be quite a challenge when you're putting together something that is, as interlinked, and in, for a book that is equal parts memoir and critique, to be able to, get your topics introduced in an order where, I can easily imagine, having a draft where, you really have to be oh, but I'm talking about this thing, but I'm not explaining it until this chapter, 100 pages later. But if I move that forward, then how do I, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it was the ones that were the most difficult to place was I had to figure out, basically I knew that all of the, this is what ableism looks like. This is what the tropes look like. Chapters kind of went at the beginning. The tropes chapter is really fun, by the way, because I actually go and do a bunch of the things that happen in movies. And there are some consequences for my actions, I'll put it that way. But so I knew all of that kind of had to go at the beginning. But then it was like, okay, so what comes first? Like, do I talk about gender? I need to talk about gender before I talk about the romance genre. I need to talk about gender before I talk about the motherhood chapter. But does the medical chapter come before or after all of that? And I realized, like, well, the motherhood chapter kind of leads into the medicalization chapter, so, like, those two need to kind of go together. The horror and romance chapters needed to go next to each other because they have a lot in common about how they view disabled bodies. And frankly, most romance that has disabled people in it is kind of horrifying for us, even if it doesn't look that way to non-disabled people. So, like, I kind of had to see what logically fit together and how to tell the story in a way that would sort of help people learn.
That makes a whole lot of sense. It's also, like, it's interesting, again, to, like, put the horror and romance chapters next to each other because, you know, this isn't an original thought for me, but it feels like, and there's been a lot of words written about how horror and romance are really, like, linked together in a lot of ways around, you know, especially around just being shat on in the general, like, literary milieu because they are both extremely visceral genres.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to like, you know, I'm really looking forward to reading the book and finding out, like, how those genres link together in terms of disability rep and in terms of like that horrific or like monstrousness.
Well, I mean, it's tricky because, like, so often disabled people are paired with monsters. Like, for those of you who haven't read my piece on The Shape of Water, I Belong Where the People Are, I specifically talk about the fact that, like, you can only find love if you are with a monster. And in some cases, that's a literal monster, like the fish monster. But in some cases, it's like Children of a Lesser God, where the main character gets together with an abusive man. And that's another kind of monster. And so it's like, we're always being paired with monstrosity or with unkindness. And when there isn't an unkindness match, it's something like Jojo Moya's Me Before You, in which case the only good disabled person is a dead one. Like,
right.
Fall in love with me, but we're never going to have sex, and when I die, by my own choice, you're going to get all of my money. That's not a romance novel. But it's being shelved as one.
Yeah, that is, you know, I mean, it's in line with, like, the whole fridging, man pain,
you know, bearing a queer,
trunking, like, all of that is all kind of interlinked there.
Yep.
And like, all really, like, comes back to, you know, in some ways, all comes back to, like, the monstrousness of society.
Yeah.
That, like, you know, we live in this society that is white supremacist and patriarchal and, you know, cis heteronormative and doesn't allow space and doesn't allow space for anything that does not conform to that.
Yeah. I think it's also the fact that in our society we've kind of gotten to this point where I wouldn't say that being queer is accepted. There's certain kinds of queer that are accepted. Like, mainstream society is, at this point, pretty comfortable with pictures of lesbian brides in white dresses and gay men in suits being happy together. Like, there's sort of a mainstream queerness that has become, I think, fairly widely acceptable. But people are still really uncomfortable with disabled people getting married. People are still really uncomfortable, specifically with disabled people being in relationships with non-disabled people, especially when it's a visible disability. And that discomfort comes across in fiction, it comes across in media, it comes across in just daily life. So I think that that's part of the problem, is that we still don't have a cultural comfort with the idea of disabled people experiencing pleasure or love.
Yeah, and that I imagine that made writing the romance chapter kind of tricky in some ways. Yeah.
Well, I definitely had this debate. I was like, I need to write about the romance genre. I need to make sure people understand why it's so toxic for disabled people, but also in every single chapter I talk about my own life, which means I have to talk about my sex life in a book that's being published by Simon and fucking Schuster. Like,
right.
What have I done? So that was a real tricky space for me, and I ultimately made the decision that it was more important to make myself uncomfortable in order to be sure that people got to be validated, right? Like, part of the job of this book is validating that deaf-blind women and deaf women and blind women have sexuality and have sexual experiences. And part of that job is also to educate non-disabled people and make them go, oh wow, that just happened. I now have to sit with my feelings about it.
Yeah. But, I imagine for the disabled readers of any stripe, but especially the deaf-blind or deaf-blind readers of your book, like, that, having that representation in there would be really powerful for them.
And that's why I leaned on the side of being uncomfortable. Because I didn't want to make people feel like I wasn't being honest. And that honesty is part of what makes memoir work. There's a certain amount of discomfort that you end up needing to be in order to tell your story.
Yeah. Memoir is such an interesting genre to me. I haven't actively written anything in that space in, a decade. I took classes on memoir in both high school and college, and creative nonfiction in general. But it's so, it's so interesting to me because, memoir is so different. I think a lot of people don't understand that memoir is a very different space than autobiography. Like, autobiography is, here are the facts, and, on this day I woke up at this time and had toast, but had forgotten to refill the butter dish or whatever.
Right, and memoir is more like, there's a section in the book where I talk about what it's like to acquire language. And so, it gets into the weird, almost metaphysical, weird metaphysical bits of being human that I think autobiography can't touch because it needs to be more factual. Right.
Yeah, there's an idea in the, creative nonfiction space of, the only word I can think of for it right now is truthiness. I know there's a, more... verisimilitude. The important part is that it feels true, and there's a certain amount of latitude that you get to use when writing memoir, when writing these creative pieces.
Well, I mean, my very best friend in the whole world read the book, and she came over for cocktails, and we were chatting, and she's like, it's so interesting because I remember the other pieces of what was happening in these moments in the book. And I know I'm one of the very few people who will actually be able to see, I see what you left out. And it's well, yeah, because I had to make, and this is such a weird sentence to say, I had to figure out what fit the narrative. When you start having to decide what parts of your life help you tell the story, that's part of what makes it memoir and not autobiography. Because in autobiography, you don't get to pick and choose what you tell people.
Yeah. Yeah, and you also, like, part of that gets to be, like, a non-linearity of time. Like, we know that time is completely fake. If 2020 and 2021 has taught us nothing else, it's that.
Yep.
But the space to jump backwards and forwards in time, to draw parallels, to make a point in that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're talking now on September the 13th. We just 2 days ago had the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and it reminded me of a piece that I wrote a decade ago that I have posted on my website about my experience of 9/11, because, you know, as a millennial, I am contractually obligated to write a 9/11 thing.
I will never write a 9/11 thing. I can't do it. My experience was really intense. Which is really all I'm going to say about that. So...
Yeah.
Well, I think it's actually interesting. That's sort of something I've been talking about a lot, sort of in the run-up to the release of the book, is that I actually do have things I won't talk about. Mm-hmm. Because privacy is really precious, and we give away a lot of privacy when we write nonfiction that has to do with our lives. Like, we give away certain precious things that we can't get back. And so deciding what stays private and what doesn't is actually a really important skill for memoirists and personal essayists to learn. And so I'm trying to make sure that I talk about that at any of my pre-book appearances, because I think validating that I actually do have a private life and that there are some things that are not open to discussion actually feels really empowering.
Yeah, it really is. It is an exertion of control there. And in a way where, like, in this day and age, for anybody, like, being able to exert control over your life, over your narrative, is so important.
Yeah, with social media, we lose a lot of our narrative.
Yeah, I definitely, like, you know, I think we're all familiar to a greater or lesser extent with that push and pull of, like, wanting to share things to, you know, like, there are parts of my life that I never share on social media, and that's, like, just a very intentional decision. Like, I will talk about my work in broad strokes because there are things from my job that I think are important to share with people when I'm, you know, talking about how to keep yourself safe on the internet in terms of, like, keeping your information safe, keeping your computer safe, that sort of stuff. But, like, I don't talk about my employer. I don't talk a lot about my personal life outside of, like, you know, the sort of, like, funny, shareable, not really personal things.
Yeah, like, there's a lot that I don't talk about in my personal life, and I actually used to talk about it more. And I've been making that shift because of the book. Like, I've been making the decision that, like, this book is big enough and it's telling enough stories that need to be told that I actually need to pull back and give myself a little bit more space to breathe. Like, that became really clear to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, you know, we're kind of talking around some of this already, but this weird blue police box just showed up in my office here, and I'm wondering if we can step into this time machine together and go back and talk to, if there are some things that you wish that younger you had known, either as a writer or just as a person, that would be helpful, you know, helpful for people listening to hear and helpful for yourself.
I think for me, it was always the permission to identify the way that I do. A lot of people have tried to take the word disabled away from me. I was raised by people who didn't identify me as disabled. I was always told, oh, you're not really blind. And that cost me in community, and it cost me in adaptive aids, and it also just cost me in time. Because if I had been identifying as blind from the age of 12, I could have been in a place where I was ready and able to do the work that I've been doing for the last 5 years a lot sooner. And I would have known more blind people, and I would have known more deaf people. And I think having sort of people try to tell me who I was supposed to be because of the body that I didn't have, or the body that they wanted me to have, really cost me in somewhat my writing ability. Because I had to do all of the processing to get to the fact that I was deafblind through my work. Like, my writing for the last 10 years has been on the topic of disability. And in 2010 or 2011, this is actually kind of funny and relevant. So I had a piece in Offbeat Bride. It was kind of my first, like, powerful disability rights piece. It was called Blind Women Get Married Too. And I'm friendly with Ariel Stallings, who is the woman who runs it. And so she was like, oh, you have a book coming out. I want to support you. I'm going to, like, repost your article on the page. And, like, we're going to, you know, I'd love to have you write something new for us before the book comes out. So for Disability Week, she posted my piece about being blind and getting married. And some very well-meaning people rolled up into the comments on Facebook to be like, but she identifies as deafblind. Why are you only referring to her as a blind person? And it's like, well, my identity's changed between 2011 and 2021. Imagine that.
Shocking, that.
So, but I think it's interesting because the way that people approach identity on the internet now, people are sort of like very defensive of what people say they are, and that's great, except for the part where you have to recognize that people grow and change.
Yeah, and like that is there is, you know, a lot of capital D discourse about that. Sort of on the wider scale, you know, I see a lot of discourse around that more with queer people, but, like, you know, it's one of those things, like, I was using a different set of pronouns this time last year. Like, people get to change their identity, change how they identify, like, throughout time. Like, identity is not static, and being able to exert that control over your identity, over how you identify, is, like, really powerful and really, like, affirming to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people just accepting that, like, if somebody has changed their identity, maybe don't call the publisher out on the difference, especially if it's a 10-year-old article.
Right.
But also, like, because we are now more open as a culture to specifically gender identity changes, I think it's really important for people to just sort of sit back and let people tell their own story, which really gets back to the advice that I would give myself, you know, hopping into the blue time box, is like, don't let people take away the language that you want to use just because they're more comfortable with it. Like, you have to be true to who you are and what your body tells you. Not, like, non-disabled people don't live in my body. And a lot of the time, non-disabled people really want to tell me whether or not I'm deaf and blind. And sometimes even other deaf and blind people want to tell me whether or not I'm deaf and blind, because my deafness and my blindness are different from theirs. And it's not a competition, and you don't live inside of my body. You have no idea what I can or can't see or hear. So
yeah,
asking people to sort of perform their identity consistently is almost baffling. Like, especially for blindness and deafness especially, they are degenerative conditions, or at least they can be. And aging happens to disabled people too. So, like, I don't know. Will my hearing get worse over the next 10 years? Probably. Will my sight get worse over the next 10 years? Don't know. Really hope not. But, like, IDK.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't gatekeep other people's identities, and don't gatekeep your own identity.
Yeah, I think it's really both. And it's also, like, not assuming what's going on in somebody's body just because you live in one that's similar.
Yeah. Yeah, it is very much like, you know, in whatever way people perceive you, like, their perception does not necessarily line up to facts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's hitting me in the queer feels.
Yeah, I feel like disability and queerness actually have a lot in common. And that has been my experience as a disabled queer. But also, like, I think that being raised in a queer community kind of prepared me for what it would be like to be a disabled person in ways that still sort of surprise me.
Yeah. That, I mean, like, I'm just thinking about what you said a few minutes ago about, like, if you had been allowed to identify yourself as deafblind when you were younger, like, think of all of the friends, all of the connections you would have in those communities now. That, you know, as somebody who didn't, like, come out as queer until their 30s, like, you know, I obviously have a lot of queer friends now and had a bunch of queer friends because, like, we flock together even when we don't know it.
Yep.
But
we travel in packs like wolves.
Yep. And like wolves, we are misunderstood by science.
Yep. There's actually a funny meme that I will sort of leave with people, which is that it's also neurodivergent people travel in packs. So if you find that all of your friends are autistic and have ADHD, it might be time to get an assessment of some variety if you too experience things like RSD weasels and forgetting what's in your fridge after 24 hours.
Oh, yeah.
Certain memes are just true.
Certain memes know exactly where you live and will come into your house at 2 a.m. Yeah.
Yep.
The internet is very good, but the internet is also very bad and mean.
The internet is complicated.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, before we get going, one of the things I've started to do recently is give my guests a chance to pump up some things, media of whatever form that they've been consuming that they really want other people to know about.
I just watched Ready or Not last night. Have you heard about it?
I have not.
It is a horror movie about a family that has an initiation ritual for new members in which you have to play a game. And in this game, you basically pull a card from a magical box, and depending on what the card is, it decides what game you play on your wedding night. And the bad one is hide and seek. So, of course, like, she pulls the hide and seek card, and it becomes a game of very deadly hide and seek with a bride in a dress running around. And it is darkly comedic, but also it was very validating for spoiler reasons, and I really appreciated that they landed effectively a don't trust cis men plot really well. Because I keep wanting horror to do more of that. I keep wanting it to be like, yes, cis men are evil. And it actually happens. It's sort of similar to The Invisible Man, but I think this one was much easier to watch because it was a lot quirkier. Like, board game Empire family wants you to play hide and go seek and try to kill you. Slightly less, abusive husband who has an Invisible Man suit. So that's what I watched last night. I also really enjoyed The Chair, which was complicated because it's not super accurate for academia in a lot of ways, but it also really, deeply exemplifies what it's like to parent children in Gen Alpha. So if you need some commiseration on parenthood, I highly recommend that show. And then I'm rereading the Poisonwood Bible right now. I do not talk about my partner much, but he came from an ex-evangelical background. And so I'm rereading it because it's a book that I didn't really like. It's not a book that I enjoyed. But because it's problematic when it comes to disability.
Fabulous. Elsa, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Listeners, be on the lookout for Being Seen wherever you buy fine books. And be on the lookout next month when our guests will be Rem Wigmore and Freya Marsk. Tales from the Trunk is mixed and produced in beautiful Oakland, California. Our theme music is Paper Wings by Ryan Boyd. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/trunkcast. All patrons of the show now get a sticker and logo button, along with show outtakes and other content that can't be found anywhere else. You can find the show on Twitter at Trunkcast, and I tweet at HBBisnieks. If you like the show, consider taking a moment to rate and review us on your preferred podcast platform. And remember, don't self-reject.